taking the tradition on, sometimes people come expecting it to be a storytelling concert, and it is not a storytelling concert. It is usually with a storyteller, but this is our chance to have a conversation, to find out what's behind the stories that a storyteller tells. This is the chance to ask all the questions that I don't normally have a chance to ask. It's to find out why a storyteller became a storyteller, what it is that drives them, what inspires them, what excites them, what they challenge themselves to do, what they're still trying to learn as part of their art form. And you can join in with those questions too. This is a rare opportunity to kind of get into those layers of the storyteller. The current series is called We Are What We Tell, and which is a very broad title. And I'm just gonna, I think we're gonna not close the door, but just put it ajar. I think everybody's in now, and I think it's time to do an official welcome to all of you, an official welcome to my guest Tamar. So welcome to Taking the Tradition On, and welcome tonight to my guest, to Tamar Eluned Williams. Now I live with almost a foot in two worlds. I live right on the edge between England and Wales, and I'm just slightly on the England side. So I spend a lot of my time looking at Wales, and I see the mountains, and my horizon is obviously over the border. And today is St. David's Day, so I thought it was only fitting that we should have a Welsh storyteller. And my storyteller today is a wonderful Welsh woman. She is bilingual. She speaks and tells in both Welsh and English. She won the Young Storyteller of the Year in 2013 and just has been motoring along in the world of storytelling ever since. She just seems to go from strength to strength, doing all kinds of exciting and new and innovative things. She's now one of the leading lights behind Beyond the Border International Storytelling Festival, and heavily involved with their online programme, reaching out from Wales across the whole of the world and finding different ways to connect people, bring people together, and to share stories and cultures. So please put your virtual hands together, go wild on the chat for the wonderful Tamar Eluned Williams. Tamar, welcome.
And Dydd Gwyl Dewi hapus. Happy St David's Day to you. You are just over the border after all.
We are just over the border, and we are brought to you tonight by the magic of Zoom. And I must say thank you very much to Get a Word in Edgeways Festival, because I'm on their very posh Zoom, with lots of people in this amazing webinar function. And I also just need to say thank you to my patrons at patrons.amydouglas.com, because it is my patrons that make this possible. Thank you very, very much. So it's free to anybody and everybody is welcome here, but if you do particularly like Taking the Tradition On and you want to become a patron, that's where you will hear who our next guests are first, and it's where we can do more chatting about Taking the Tradition On and other things. But now we're going to focus on you, Tamar, our guest for tonight, and Wales. It is St. David's Day, and we have people here, as we were saying, from all over. Oh, I'm too loud. Oh dear. I'm very sorry. I quite often am too loud. I will try and turn myself down.
I'll speak up, Elaine.
I'll push myself back a little. We're going to do the really technical thing of I'm going to just go further away from the computer, and Tamar can get closer. Right, Tamar, can you be closer to the microphone? Speak up.
Is this better? Can you hear better?
We're waiting for Elaine to get going on the chat.
All right. Well, I'll speak loudly and clearly. I am just on my computer microphone. It's not the best in the world. There we go. Great. Brilliant. That's fine. That's great.
Oh, if that's great now. I was going to see if I could play with the settings, but I'm not entirely sure I can do very much about Tamar's. Yeah, so it is St. David's Day, and we have people here tonight from all over the world, as we've said, from Slovenia, from Vancouver, from the United States of America, from Belgium, and people obviously watch afterwards as well. And I sometimes feel that Wales is not as well known as I expect it to be. So, will you tell us a little bit about the wonderful country that you live in?
I will happily, because you're absolutely right. Wales is kind of often, I suppose, consumed by the conglomerate that is Britain, and it is part of British and United Kingdom culture, but it is also a distinct culture within that. So, for people who don't know, Wales is kind of the western bit of the United Kingdom. It's the bit that looks like a woman pointing out to sea with a head and a skirt. It's quite a small country, but we do have a very distinct culture. We share a border with England, as Amy says, and we also share the Irish Sea, and across the Irish Sea is Ireland. Our culture is kind of distinctly Celtic, I would say. So a lot of the stories that I tell, the myths and legends and the folk tales, have a kind of distinctly Celtic feel, and there are similarities among the folklore that I tell with other Celtic folklore like Cornish and Irish and Scottish. One of the kind of most distinct things about Wales, apart from what people normally associate with Wales, which is landscape, because we do have some stunning parts of the country. We have mountains, we have 3 national parks here. But one of the most distinct things is our language. Welsh is an official minority language in Wales. And of all the Celtic languages, it's probably the one that is doing the best in terms of the amount of people that speak it and how it is used in daily life. The Welsh government has put quite a lot of really high targets on getting as many people to speak Welsh as possible. And I'm almost kind of a product of that. My parents, neither of them speak Welsh. My father is from Wales, but his parents were of a generation when the language was being oppressed, and so he didn't get the chance to learn Welsh, but he sent me to a Welsh language school, and that's how I got to learn Welsh and got to be able to work now in Welsh and be bilingual, which is such an incredible, rich gift to have. I suppose, we do have this distinct culture, we do have this distinct language in Wales. But Wales is also a very international country. We're very outward facing in general, in comparison to the rest of the United Kingdom, or certainly England. We tend to vote in a more kind of progressive way. We have some people often think of Wales as being incredibly rural and that it's full of sheep, but we have vast urban areas in Wales. I'm originally from Cardiff, which is the capital city. And we've also got these kind of old industrial areas, which is where the coal mines would have been up until the 1980s, when they were mostly closed down, which kind of surround Cardiff in the south of Wales. And really, when you think about rural Wales, you're thinking about kind of the north and the west. But yeah, you're right, Amy. I mean, in general, whenever I'm abroad and I say that I'm from Wales, people don't know where Wales is. The word Britain is used interchangeably with the word England a lot of the time. So people will say English when they mean British. And, I think there's just a tiny feeling of loss when that happens, because, being Welsh and being British is something that I am 2 things together, but I am increasingly more Welsh than I am British. It feels like
And you're definitely not English.
I'm definitely not English. In terms of people who don't know where Wales is as well, a lot of people will be like, well, how far is it from London? It's quite a big place, so some parts are about 3 hours from London, some parts are more like 7 hours from London. Where I live is about 4 hours from London, just so you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting for me because I suppose we've also stolen quite a lot of your folklore in England, and certainly where I am is interesting because I'm on the English side of the current border, but I'm on the west side of the River Severn. So actually, traditionally, and until quite recently, where I live would have been in Wales, and the river would have been the natural border, and the River Severn is part of quite a lot of Welsh folklore.
Yeah.
So I suppose I probably do know more about Welsh folklore than a lot of people who live in England, and I work quite a lot in Wales as well, and I definitely feel like I come from the Welsh marches. I live in the Welsh marches, and and that is kind of it's a borderland
Mm.
place.
Well, yeah,
Um,
on an important point, which is that Britain, or Prydain as it would have been, it's not correct to say that it was all Wales, because it was just all Britain. But the original Brythonic language is thought to be very similar to what Welsh is, and the folklore of Britain is usually the folklore of Wales as well. So a lot of our Welsh mythology talks about Britain or Prydain as being one country, and that is where the stories just happen. There's no sense of borders within those stories. Um, so even though I think of myself as a Welsh storyteller, really I am telling the folklore and the mythology of Britain.
yeah, and I would think of it as those stories as well. The other term that is often used is the Isle of the Mighty,
Yeah.
and that which is it's the whole country. And so I think when people think about English folklore, one of the first things that they will come up with, one of the first legends. I'm wondering if anybody's going to shove it up on the chat. Actually, when you think of English folklore, when you think of the greatest English hero, who do you think of?
Yeah.
King Arthur. Yes, absolutely.
100 storyteller points to Cecilia.
Absolutely. So, Tamar, would you say that King Arthur is English?
And
Oh, Mike, there's always one. Yes.
this is something that happens all the time, because you watch all these programs where they'll talk about um, the great hero of England to rise and fight for England. But actually, the concept of England is younger than the concept of King Arthur. And King Arthur was a king for Britain, for Prydain. I mean, I'm not going to say that he was definitely Welsh, although there's quite a lot of proof that he probably was a king in Wales, because there's so many places across the whole of the island of Britain which claim that King Arthur was their king, or a king that was associated with their area. My mother is Cornish. She has a lot of stories about parts of Cornwall where King Arthur was associated with. Um, but he definitely isn't English. That is wrong. That's a misnomer.
And of course, I mean, side by side with him, I mean, some of the oldest stories, and there's certainly all the first references to Merlin are within the Welsh
Yeah.
canon, and that is because obviously as other people, other races have come in, um, what is now the Welsh people were kind of shoved back and were pushed back into the more mountainous area where where the dominant the predominant people in England, that would be where the guerrilla warfare was, and they couldn't actually manage to take the mountains, and so that's where the older people ended up.
Right. And
Um,
Merlin is very associated with where I live now. So I've moved west out of the city of Cardiff, and I now live in a part of Wales called Carmarthenshire, which is kind of in the southwest. And the biggest town in Carmarthenshire is Carmarthen. The word Carmarthen in Welsh is Caerfyrddin, and Myrddin is the Welsh word for Merlin. So this is considered to be Merlin's birthplace. The town of Caerfyrddin is considered to be where he was born, and there is an oak tree in Caerfyrddin, which is Merlin or Myrddin's oak. And there's this whole legend associated with the oak tree, which is now literally just kind of a stump, that if that oak tree was to be taken out for any reason, if it was to fall, then the town of Caerfyrddin would also fall. So Myrddin is very Welsh. Merlin as a character is associated with this part of Wales very strongly.
so Melanie's sort of asking, so she tells Tristan and Isolde, which I've heard and which you do a beautiful version of Melanie, to intentionally live in Cornwall, but that's the story out of Wales. I've heard one theory that says it began in Scotland. I think kind of what we're saying really is it could have been anywhere within the Isle of Britain, but the people who have held that story are the people who were pushed back into Wales. So it's held in Welsh mythology, but Welsh mythology covers all of the Isle of Britain, all of the Isle of the Mighty. Is that a reasonable summation,
Yeah,
Tamar?
certainly. And I mean, also don't forget that Cornwall itself has a distinct Celtic identity, which is separate from the identity of England. I am half Cornish. My mother would kill me if I didn't mention this. They have a minority language which has unfortunately pretty much died out now in terms of I don't think there's that many people who can speak the language anymore. It's not in the same place as Welsh is. But they do have a distinct Celtic culture, which is very connected and very similar to Welsh Celtic culture. You know, Cornish as a language is very similar to Welsh. I've had conversations with Cornish speakers where we can just about understand each other because the languages work really similarly. There's a lot of traditions and folk traditions, mythology, heritage, which is directly comparable to what we have in Wales, in Cornwall. So when the original people of Britain were being pushed west, as Amy talks about, they were being pushed west into Wales, but also because Cornwall is kind of the west of England, down there into the tip of England as well, which still does have that distinct heritage to it.
So we're talking about the Welsh mythology, and the Welsh language, but we haven't quite really put them together yet. And I know that you tell in both English and in Welsh, and I'm really interested how they feel and how they slot differently on your tongue, and how the language that you're telling in shapes the story that you're telling.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting conversation because of my relationship with the Welsh language in general. As I said, I don't come from a family of native Welsh speakers. My parents sent me to a Welsh language school, but I learned Welsh in kind of more of an academic setting. That doesn't mean to say that I'm not fully bilingual. I am. I was really lucky to be able to kind of be taught through the medium of Welsh all of my subjects all the way up until sixth form. Um, but my use of Welsh, I suppose, is far less dialectical than someone who was speaking Welsh at home. So when I speak Welsh, a lot of people have no idea where I'm from because I don't really have a specific accent and I don't have any kind of dialectical turns of phrase that would mark me as being from a certain part of Wales. You know, it's a very dialectical language, Welsh. So somebody will use a turn of phrase and you'll say, you're from Carmarthen or you're from Ceredigion. You can tell where people are from. No one ever knows where I'm from. And as such, for many years, even though I was a fluent Welsh speaker, I didn't feel necessarily hugely confident performing and telling in Welsh, and particularly not in kind of formal settings, because there was always a sense that I was almost putting on something. I was putting on an outfit that wasn't mine, because of having kind of stepped into speaking Welsh and learning Welsh as somebody that wasn't from a native Welsh background, despite feeling hugely Welsh and feeling in my heart that I felt this great connection to it. But when I moved away from Wales to go to university, which is where I discovered storytelling as an art form, I was studying in Birmingham. I felt this great sense of homesickness. And as I started to tell stories, it became a very natural thing for me to instantly start interweaving Welsh into the stories that I was telling in English. And at that point, the meat of the story was still taking place in English because I wasn't telling to audiences that could speak Welsh. So I would use Welsh interwoven into the fabric of the story so people could hear the language, but I wasn't really using Welsh to tell the story. Then I moved back to Wales and I was faced with this choice of, am I going to tell mostly in English using a bit of Welsh as a kind of decoration on top of the story, or am I going to bite the bullet and start telling in Welsh and stop worrying about whether I sound right? There's a lot of, I think this comes hand in hand with being a minority language. There's a lot of defensiveness around the use of the Welsh language. People worry about it being diluted in some way by people not being able to speak it correctly. And I carried all of this worry with me initially when I first started working in Welsh, that people would hear me speak Welsh while I was telling stories and think, where is she from? What dialect is she using? Why is she using that word? That's not the correct word for that thing. But I think over time, having done it more and more and more, the stories that I'm telling, I mean, most of the stories that I can tell in both languages. So I will have a story in repertoire that I can do in English and I can do it in Welsh as well. And sometimes when I tell in English, I'll interweave Welsh into it. When I tell in Welsh, it's usually what we call Uniaith Gymraeg, which is just in Welsh. That's the story, the language of the story is happening in Welsh. But I do feel increasingly that there are stories that I just want to tell in Welsh. There are ones that, for whatever reason, I tend to only tell them in Welsh because the settings where they happen are Welsh language settings. And I find them increasingly hard to tell in English, which is a really interesting shift to have made, um, because they sit with me so well in Welsh. And I mean, it comes back to this idea of two languages working in different ways.
Mm.
Welsh is, it's such a meaty language. You know, we have the rolled r sound, we have the chs, we the ll's, the thes. And when you're telling mythology, that's amazing. You can really lean into that. And sometimes I come back into English and I think, God, this is a bit flimsy. I can't really express what I'm trying to say because I don't have the right word. You know, today I was telling a story in a school at St. David's Day. So we were doing the story of the witch Ceridwen, which is the birth of Taliesin, the story of the birth of Taliesin. And he goes through all these different transformations in this story, he turns into all these different animals. And, you know, it was an English language school, so I was interweaving some Welsh into the story, but mostly the story was in English. And I talked about how he turned into a hare. And then I taught them the Welsh word for hare, which is the best word, ysgyfarnog. And I mean, when you compare the word ysgyfarnog with the word hare, there is no comparison. Ysgyfarnog is just such a meatier word. And it's just such a good word to say as well, because you can ysgyfarnog, you know, everyone can enjoy that word, whereas hare is like hare.
And there's lots of different words for. I mean, you know, you took going back to the dialect because I didn't know that word for hair in Welsh, and actually the word that I know for hair in Welsh wouldn't work for that story because the story that I know it from is much younger. So I only know hair as Oenbach Melengeth,
Right.
so Melengeth's little lambs, you know, and which is the summation of a whole story. Why kind of, you know, hares become Saint Melengeth's little lambs, you know, because she's been chased by this prince, and the hare has taken refuge underneath her skirts, and he's got all the dogs around and he's barking, and it ends up that kind of, you know, he meets a saintly woman and he doesn't take advantage, like happens in many stories, but instead gifts her the valley to as a sanctuary to animals and a sanctuary to women and a sanctuary to people. And that's a whole story that was sort of almost sent out into the whole of Britain as this is a safe place for women to come, this is a place of sanctuary, this is a place of refuge. And I find that as soon as I venture into Welsh, everything has a story, and you have a 3-word phrase, and it's got this legend that it's sat on top of, and this whole discussion that is very briefly and quickly put into like a tiny phrase. And I wish that I was a fluent Welsh speaker. I mean, I started to learn and I only know little bits. But what I did find, and I suspect this is the same with every language, is that as soon as you put on a different language onto your tongue, it's the language that you use language to think in. You use language to phrase an entire culture and all of the morals of a culture, and the way that you see things is all phrased and couched in that language.
Yeah.
And I learned so much about the culture in a very short time of just starting to learn little phrases, and I found it a really creative time because I discovered all of these stories that were on little phrases. So there's a place up in North Wales called Pysithrider, which is it's a beautiful waterfall. It's the highest waterfall, certainly in Wales, and I think it might be in Britain. It's not like one of these massive waterfalls that you would get in Scotland, but it's very high. It's got a ferry bridge over the top of it, but right at the top is Llynllyn House. So it's the lake with the image of cheese, and straight away you know exactly why it's called that, and you've got that thing of kind of it's very high up, but it's a flat moor. The moon comes up, and you get a golden ball up on the top in the sky, and you have this cheese that's hanging in a still lake, and you can see it as an image of cheese in the water. And there's a whole story about a huiber, like a water dragon that's completely involved in that. And again, it's from one phrase. It leads you into all of these tendrils of myth and story that are so interwoven. And we were talking about kind of the Welsh mythology and that those stories encompass all of Britain. But if you get out a Welsh map, there are so many stories and journeys within stories that you can just follow in the place names across the map. And literally, if you speak Welsh, then the whole map of Wales is like it's like a massive storybook.
It's quite incredible. And I mean, particularly some of the myths that I tell, the fourth branch of the Mabinogi is one of the most, for me anyway, out of my repertoire, one of the most landscape rooted stories, because in that story we have, it begins with a battle between the north and the south of Wales. At that time there are two kings ruling, one in the north, one in the south, and they have very specific places where they're ruling, which you can go to today. So we know that there would have been some kind of fort there would have been some kind of settlement there at least. And then the story journeys on its way, and as it does, we go to different places. We hear about another castle that gets set up, Mir Castell, which is actually where the power station at Trawsfynydd in the centre of Wales is now, which is considered to be one of the oldest settlements. There would have been people settling there for thousands of years. And it's interesting because the landscape of that story appears to be kind of both couched in sort of like a reality of, yes, there would have been settlements here, so probably, yes, there was a castle there, and it might have had this name. And then these kind of incredibly mythical sounding places, like there's a place called Llyn, which is Lake of the Maidens. And the reason that that lake is given that name is because right at the end of the story, one of our characters is escaping from another with her maidens, and her maidens are so scared of the person that they're escaping from, because he's a great powerful wizard, that they cannot look forwards as they're running. They have to keep looking over their shoulders. And because they're looking over their shoulders, they run over the edge of a mountain down into the lake and they drown. And that is why that is called Lake of the Maidens, Llyn. You've got the lake under Snowdon as well, which has the name Glaslyn Blue Lake, but that lake is supposed to be where the great creature of the Avanc was put into in chains. So all these lakes have these kind of connections to it, and you're absolutely right. Sometimes you just pick up a map and you see a name and there's a story, but you don't know what the story is. I only heard about a new one recently. I was running a session for some young people 2 nights ago, and someone said, oh, you know that lake near where you live, it's called Llyn. And I was like, I do know the lake, but why is it called Llyn? And he said, well, Llyn means lake of, sorry, I'm trying to translate as I talk, it's always very difficult, lake of Owain Slate. And I said, oh, okay, well, was there a person called Owain? And he proceeded, this young guy, to tell me a whole story about Llyn, which is essentially the story of a young knight who comes to the lake. At that point, there is no lake there, but he wants a drink. He takes a slate away from the ground and water comes spilling out, and he loses the slate and it fills up this kind of great sinkhole, and there's a lake. And that's why it's called Llyn, which I'm pretty sure is also the story of, there's loads of Celtic stories that have that as a motif, the idea of someone uncovering something and then suddenly there's water there, which makes me think, is this the story of the lake, or did someone just hear another story and think, oh, that's great, we'll call Llyn, but that'll be Llyn story as well. Or maybe it is Llyn story. But yeah, do you know, that's just fantastic. I live here and I did not know that story, and I've just been told it.
And that does seem to happen all of the time in Wales, and it's and the place names are old. I mean, they haven't changed. They, you kind of unless you go and you see all the English names, because obviously most places in Wales have 2 names, or certainly all the bigger places, and a lot of the English names are things really exciting, things like Newtown.
Well, we've got at the moment, which is a lot of incredible old properties have amazing old names, old farmhouses, or the site of original old farmhouses, which have names very specific, Cry of the Blackbird or something like that. And then somebody moves in who cannot speak Welsh and they change that name. There's one near me and it's called Hakuna Matata. And I just don't think there's, and then we come back to this idea of Welshness being something that people don't really understand or necessarily value if they come from outside of Wales, because it is subsumed by Britishness. It's not considered something that is valuable by a lot of other people who are from Britain, but not necessarily Welsh, because it is kind of within this envelope of Britishness. And I think they don't understand the kind of cultural degradation that taking names away has done. We have so many place names in Wales that have been anglicised to be able to be said easier by people who don't speak Welsh. And then we also just have place names that, because they're too confusing or difficult for people who don't speak Welsh, they are just kind of erased eventually. So I think I find it difficult to talk about this sometimes, because I've got a lot of friends who are not from Wales, but I've had to explain to them on so many occasions as well how kind of important language is, minority language, because we are constantly in a battle of trying to preserve, while not trying to keep something in aspic, trying to preserve something and trying to defend it. I feel like we're constantly defending the existence of the Welsh language. We have the British media running programmes on whether Welsh is pointless. That happened a few years ago. There was a Panorama programme on debating whether the existence of the Welsh language was pointless. We frequently have newspaper articles run by, The Guardian, The Times, debating whether or not Welsh should be taught in schools, whether Welsh is a waste of money. And the argument that always comes back is, well, what's the point of preserving something when it is a minority language? You should just teach your children Spanish if you want to teach them a language. But that completely misunderstands the purpose of language, which is that it is more than just being able to communicate with someone. It is about your heritage, it's about your culture, it's about who you are, it's about your heartbeat. My mother is from Cornwall originally. She doesn't speak that much Welsh, but having lived in Wales and had 2 children grow up who study in Welsh, who are bilingual, she can now understand a huge amount of Welsh, and she has enough Welsh to be able to communicate with, her Welsh level is like 2-year-olds, so she communicates with children and animals in Welsh, and that is her Welsh, And I think, I feel like I'm constantly having to debate with people the existence of my language, my culture, and it's deeply upsetting, I think, outside of Wales. In Wales, there's great understanding of it, but outside of Wales, because it's not spoken by as many people as should speak it, it's not considered important anymore.
So I'm looking, and Elaine is just like, going, it's heartbreaking, which is just exactly how I feel as well. As a storyteller, language is my tool. It's my life. I love playing with language. I love word puzzles and riddles and plays on words, and kind of just words that feels nice in your mouth, and rhythm and poetry. And I'm not able to do that in a different language, and I would love to be bilingual and to be able to do that in a different language. And for somebody to take away my first language, I mean, I'm very lucky in that, English is widely spoken. Though in some ways I feel that that's a disadvantage, because it means that England and Britain generally, but certainly the English part of Britain, does not value other languages, because we assume everybody's just going to understand us. And so we're not taught other languages, and by the time it's our own choice to learn, we've lost capability, because you can learn to a certain extent once you're past puberty, but you will never sound fluent. You will always have an accent. It is one of those things that you lose at puberty, the ability to completely learn another language properly. And I think that play in language and that ability to understand 2 cultures, I think if more English people were bilingual, they would have a lot more empathy and a lot more compassion and a greater understanding of the world in general. And I think that is a gift that English people could really use, actually. And whatever language you are in, your first language, I think mother tongue is a phrase that English has got right, actually. Your mother tongue is hugely important, and that play and that sense of your own parents, and that link of ancestors, and everything that is carried within language, which I think maybe you only realise when you start to learn another language, how much is held within your own tongue, is just vital. It's so important. And Elaine is just saying, kind of it's the same with all minority languages, and it's the same, with the people of colour, and kind of there are many places in the world with minority languages, and where I'm saying it would be much easier if everybody all spoke the same language, and life isn't easy, and and it it might be easier, but like you kind of, if you just go to Amazon, buy everything from Amazon, maybe it's easier, but you lose an awful lot of richness and diversity and fun and games and joy, with when things become simple, I think.
And I think there's a joy in, I think maybe when you do speak multiple languages as well, you enjoy the things you don't understand. We actually did an event at Beyond the Border over the summer last year, which was called Mamiaith, which means mother tongue, where we staged storytellers who were telling to, I would say, mostly English language audience, people who did not have the languages that were being told in. Um, and they were telling in their own languages. So I told in Welsh, we had somebody telling in Gujarati, we had someone telling in Yiddish, and the offer to the audience was sit there and understand what you can and enjoy that you can't understand everything, And I think having been to festivals in Europe, where mainland Europe, where I have an A level in French. I can understand quite a lot of French, but then there's someone telling in Dutch, there's someone telling in German, and I'm telling in English usually at those festivals. I really enjoy sitting there as a storyteller and using kind of the structure of story to work out what's going on in someone's story. And it's amazing how much you actually do get. I mean, I think probably it helps that I have quite a big repertoire and quite a big understanding of stories. So I'm sitting there kind of understanding. I'm like, oh, it's this one. Oh, okay, I think he's a prince. So is he going to go do that kind of thing? But there's a joy in it. And, the audiences that came out of our Mamiaith event in Beyond the Border actually kind of loved the fact that they were sat there not really understanding the whole thing, and that they could kind of like sit back and enjoy other aspects of the performance, whether it was gestural or visual or vocal, and that they were picking up something else. And each of the storytellers we staged had a different technique. So Seth Townsend, who is a storyteller from London, he works a lot with people who don't speak the language of the story he's telling in. So he was like, I'm going to aim for 100% understanding. I'm going to use props and I'm going to tell a story which I think most people will know. So and I think most people understood everything he was doing. But then my friend Kerry, who was telling in a very specific Welsh dialect, which is actually difficult for people who are not fully fluent in Welsh to understand because it's very regional. He was like, I don't care how much people understand. I'm just going to tell the story and they can pick up what they pick up. And I think everybody had a different approach to it. My approach was, I'm going to do a story which is very gestural, very big, lots of big characters, and we're going to set those characters up and I'm going to try and get them to really understand what's going on. But there was a real joy in it. And I think increasingly I would love to see people who are only able to speak one language attend events where they may not be able to understand the language or some of the languages of what's going on, because it's actually very freeing. And I think once you do speak multiple languages, you start to care a lot less about what you get right and what you get wrong.
There's a really heartbreaking comments that are going on in the chat with that. Oh, poor Cecilia. I mean, I don't know if you've seen this, Tamar, but it's like her Welsh grandmother tried to teach her Welsh, but it was very hard because she would only whisper it because they weren't allowed to speak it. And if she was caught speaking it, she'd be punished at school and their families would lose their work. Kind of, it's so oppressed. And it's amazing actually in a short time how Welsh has flowered.
Yeah.
How because it was utterly on the brink, and I mean now it has blossomed. It hasn't taken a lot. Well, it has been a lot of work, but I mean it hasn't taken that much for a huge response and a huge cultural shift, and everything that you were.
No, sorry, I was just considering it's generation, because it did several generations, just like Cecilia's grandmother. The fact that we've got a whole new young generation speaking Welsh now because their parents have said, I don't speak it, but I'm going to send my child to a school where they're going to learn it, is amazing. Because it takes, I think, a sacrifice on the parents' part to be like, my child's going to speak a language that I do not speak. It is difficult.
Yeah.
I'm so in awe of parents, my parents included, who did that.
I think it's a fantastic step to take. And going back to, kind of I love it when there's people speaking in other languages. And I've been really lucky. So I've just got back from Marrakesh International Storytelling Festival. The first one, completely run on goodwill, kind of nobody got paid. the riads put up the accommodation, the storytellers, you know, kind of paid their own flights and did it for nothing. But it was a real genuine cross-cultural meeting. So Seth Townsend that you were talking came. We had an Iranian storyteller, we had American storytellers, Canadian storytellers, and this amazing new generation of young Moroccan tellers who all tell in Arabic but have at least one other language as well, most of them, either English or French or both. But I mean, I got to see one of the master Arabic storytellers who has been working with this young generation, because they got down to a point where there were only 5 master storytellers left, and they really didn't want to lose their stories, and so they've been working with these youngsters, passing those stories on. And of course, they only tell in Arabic, but watching them was just the most incredible experience. And for me, I love telling with other people. So whether that's somebody, a sign language interpreter, or, you know, as I've just been doing last week, people who've been interpreting into French and into Arabic, the amount of play that you can get from that, and the echo and the gestures and the fun that you can have with doing those sort of two-handers in different languages, it just brings a whole new aspect to storytelling that I just absolutely adore. And it's so much fun. And or it can also go the other way and really give it a sense of pathos as well. And just like when you have got those moments, it can give you that extra kind of time to sit in places of bitterness or melancholy or wistfulness, or just kind of when you need a breath to kind of digest a bit of a story. There's so many ways that you can play with that. Well, you know, this has turned into a totally different conversation to the one that I thought we were going to have.
Oh, Amy.
Which is what often happens on taking the tradition on. And but I think it's a really, really important conversation to have. And it also feels like we've only just started this conversation. But I am going to take you on. We're not going to have as much time to spend on this, because I know that this could easily be like a week's worth of conversation, not a few minutes. But when we look at those Welsh stories, they are so rich and so powerful, but they are from an utterly different era and time and mentality. And so you're carrying this way of just a wonderful, rich heritage, but you're also a young woman. And a lot of the attitudes in those stories and the way that they have been passed on are quite chauvinistic and yeah, I mean, they're male dominated, and they're also age dominated, I think. And I'm really interested in how you're working with those material and kind of not changing them, but finding a place where you can tell those comfortably and with love and kind of sit right with them.
Yeah, it's an ongoing daily challenge, I would say. I think I knew this when I picked up this material. I knew straight off the bat that this was what I wanted to tell, because these are the stories that I was told when I was in school, the stories that I remember. I wanted to tell these stories, but I think even my memory of them before I kind of returned to them as a storyteller was, where are the women? And when there are women, why is it that there's always terrible things happening to them? I mean, the weight of Welsh mythology is that it has as with quite a lot of Celtic mythology, it has a very bad history of misogyny, gender-based abuse, sexual abuse, and it is difficult to tell that material as a young woman. My general approach to working with this material is that I don't tend to I don't change what happens in the story, because the story is the story. But what I do a lot of is shifting perspective. So I will, because when the original text that I might be working with, so I've got a copy here of one book that I use a lot, which is Sioned Davies's translation of the Mabinogion. I have also got this in Welsh and in kind of early Welsh as well. And this is the original text. So this, when I say original, it's obviously not the original. It would have been told orally, but this is the kind of, I suppose, most recent translation from the initial codified stories. which are written down with a certain perspective. That perspective is broadly a male one, it's a misogynistic one. You have stories which are very kind of male heavy in terms of what happens, and you have a lot of sexual and gender-based violence which is just brushed over. You know, the fourth branch of the Mabinogion essentially is all of the instances in the story, all of the things that happen in the story are engineered around a man wanting to rape a woman and succeeding to rape a woman. And I want to caveat this by saying I tell a lot of this material in schools, but I tell a very adapted version of this material in schools. The reason I tell this material in schools is because people want to hear these stories told in schools. They think it's important for children to know the stories, but also that these stories are part of their heritage, and that as I tell those stories, I'm coming in with a different perspective. So I will often, if I'm working with children, depending on their ages, obviously, I will not necessarily talk about sexual violence. Although if they're an old enough group, I will talk to young people about that in stories. I will have these. I think that the joy of being a storyteller is that you can step out of the story when it's necessary, and you can comment on what's going on if you want to. And I have had long conversations with older storytellers about whether it is the role of the storyteller to do that, whether we should be commenting on what's going on. And I feel like that is a very privileged viewpoint to have, to be able to just be a vehicle for the story and not have or show an attitude towards it yourself. My feeling is that I am coming into this setting as a young woman. I'm a young bisexual woman. I don't necessarily hold fire with a lot of the heteronormative stuff in stories either. And I want to work with this material and shape it and be able to comment on it. So when I do talk about why is it in the fourth branch of the Mabinogion that we have a man who's cursed because he cannot marry a woman, children will say to me, well, why doesn't he just marry a man? And I'll be like, well, yeah, why doesn't he just marry a man? Unfortunately, this story is from a certain period of time, so we're going to have to suspend what we would think of as being acceptable and normal, because this is a period of time where he has to marry a woman in order to be a member of society. He has to marry a woman so he can be a lord, so he can have all the things that he wants to have. The story cannot continue.
And also, in a patriarchal society, he has to marry a woman in order to be able to get an heir, which, you know, is incredibly important. So you can have relations with men or women on the side, but if you don't have a married partner, then they are not a legitimate heir. And that's how the society is set up. And if you don't have a legitimate heir, your family loses everything. So it's not about love, just love and sex. It's about fitting into the whole way that society is engineered.
But I think what I feel like when I'm taking this material in is that it's sometimes just as much as, you know, if I was to go in and read this book, we would be having everything from the perspective of the man. And if something horrible happens to a woman, it would be, and then she was beaten by her husband every day for 7 years. And you'd be like, okay, and then we move on from that and we just tell the rest of the story. But I don't do that. I sit with moments that happen. I reflect on moments that happen. And it doesn't necessarily mean me beating the audience over the head with a stick and saying this was a terrible thing. You should all be aware that this is a terrible thing. It's much more about me just allowing more time for things sometimes. You know, the story that I was just referencing is the story of Branwen. She is a Welsh princess who's taken from Wales to Ireland to marry the Irish king in a kind of peace treaty. It goes very badly due to lots of different things. And eventually she ends up suffering terrible domestic abuse, having a child with him, being unable to leave. And when I tell that story, I tend not to sit for ages saying Branwen felt scared, she felt lost, she felt homesick, because I think those things are obvious. But what I will do is voice her, usually in Welsh, in some point in the story, to give her time to speak, because, and sometimes I do it in first person as well. Nobody who's not Welsh language in the audience will know, but I'll speak her in first person, sometimes in song or sometimes in a chant, because I feel like she needs to say something. In these texts, the women don't but things happen to them and they don't say anything. But But I think that I have the privilege of being a woman who's picking up this work and wanting to, and I can do it differently. And I should do it differently.
I mean, it's really interesting when you're saying, "Oh, it's a very privileged position to say, oh, I'm just going to be the vehicle for the story," because I suppose my question with that would be, do you think that's possible
Of course, it's not.
to?
You bring your own identity. I mean, it's even in the material that you choose to tell, how you choose to tell it. You know, the world that you choose to set up. We're all bringing in our own prejudices and ignorances and interests, and we're going to shape the material anyway. We cannot just be press play on the audiobook, off you go. Because also, every new setting that we're telling a story and every new audience is going to require something different from us, which is what I mean when I talk about telling these stories I tell these stories to every age group. You know, today I was working with nursery and year one. I tell to adults, I tell to young people, and my material rarely changes. The way I tell the stories change. What I choose to explain in the stories, what I choose to leave as a mystery, because some children really want to know the answers to everything. Others are very happy to just kind of sit there in the mystery of it. It changes. It's a conversation. I think that's what I'm trying to say. I feel like I cannot exist in a bubble as a storyteller, as someone who goes in and just transfers material to the audience. I'm always facilitating and I'm always in conversation with that audience. And the needs of that audience change every time I'm in a different room. And my needs as a storyteller change as well. You know, there are days when I go in and I think, I can't tell that story today. I'm not going to tell that story today. I'm going to do a different one. And as I grow and change and get older as a woman and move towards potentially becoming a mother and having children of my own, my stories are going to change. The way I tell them, I won't tell different stories, but the way I tell them will change. Because I'm not a jukebox. I have to change everything that I do. And I don't understand how you can exist in a space where you can just relay story. And if you can, then in some ways that's quite remarkable, but I don't know how anyone does that.
For me, somebody like that isn't really a storyteller. I mean, and that's a conversation that I've got into on many occasions, but not for now. But kind of, what is the difference between an actor and a storyteller? You know, and it's um if you're going to be a storyteller, there has to be a reason for you to tell the stories that you tell, and there has to be a reason for you to want to be a storyteller. And there is this thing that there's no fourth wall, that everything you do is a conversation, that you are creating this space with the audience, and you are holding that world. And we started off, you know, most of what we've talked about tonight has been about language. Every word that you choose, and the color and the slant that you choose to put onto the language and the perspective that you tell from, everything is a choice. There's no way that you can just be a vehicle without making those choices. And I would say that if you're going to be a responsible storyteller, and if you're going to be a good storyteller, and if you're striving to be better, then you're going to be making conscious choices, rather than just you know, kind of just relying on stereotypes and the same old trope that you've heard other people tell, which is an entirely, you know, why would you do that? where is the challenge and the interest and the creativity in that?
Yeah, but it's such a responsibility when you do think of the weight of every word, because I do think of that when I'm telling, particularly to children, um, because my repertoire is still rooted in mythology and folktale, and I do think about, I am still coming in and telling you stories about kings and queens and princes and princesses, and sometimes there are things in the stories that I tell that are actually pretty cliched and stereotypical. We'll talk about them as the story continues. We might talk about it after the story. You know, I will leave some things. I mean, the children are very good nowadays at saying, why is the princess having to sit in the tower? You know, they are great at doing that. But I do think about the weight of my responsibility as a storyteller. And, you know, I remember very well the moment that I realized that I was still using the word beautiful to describe a certain character in a story. and the impact that that had on my audience of children, which is that when I actually, going back to the story of the birth of Taliesin and the witch Ceridwen, I used to set that story up by saying something along the lines of, there was a witch and her name was Ceridwen. She was very powerful and she was very beautiful. And I realized that particularly the young girls in the room would hear the word beautiful and they would latch onto her and they would become really obsessed with her as a character. And after I told the story, when we were talking about it, they would want to know more about the beautiful woman. And it wasn't because she was powerful and magical and terrifying and could turn herself into all these different animals. It was because she was beautiful. And it was because I used that word. And I have since become very circumspect about how I use certain words, because I have to be aware that my audience are coming into the room with a huge set of kind of societal influences already. So if I say something specific that will kind of draw upon, you know, children in particular, their interest, oh, she's beautiful, I like her then. And other words like ugly, fat, because there are all these kind of societal pressures upon those words that we are taught that somebody who is ugly must be bad. You know, the story of Tatterhood is a brilliant example of that, because in the story of Tatterhood, she is considered to be hideous, but she's an incredible character, and that's a great story to tell. And I think using the word ugly in that story is probably quite a useful word, because it is very much, you know, subverting what our societal image of somebody who is ugly is. And it's amazing when you do story making with children how many times they'll say my evil character is fat and ugly, which are two words that are not associated with someone's character or who they are, but they'll use them anyway to describe someone who's evil.
And I think, yeah, well, and the story of Ceridwen is particularly difficult, I think, with that one. And it's one that I do love to tell, but I've struggled and kind of, again, kind of really gone through word choices, because obviously you've got Ceridwen, who traditionally is this beautiful and powerful witch, but she's also got the sun. The whole point of the potion is that her son is a Vagthi, who is utter darkness.
And
Um,
can't do magic, hideous, you know, kind of like a sort of child of darkness, which, and the word dark, you know, we're back to that conversation around the what our society, in particular Western society, associates with darkness and blackness, and how that makes its way into folk tales as well. And when we had a really long conversation about the character that you were working on, I can't remember what you ended up deciding to do with that.
Well, I went, yeah, the Black Thief of Slain, and that was one of those conversations where one of those things where I needed to go all around the houses to go right back to the beginning, and I ended up just calling him the Thief of Slain and just took the word out. But I had gone through a lot of possibilities before coming back to that,
Yeah.
and it's still a work in progress. It's still absolutely work in progress, and I still find things funny for my tongue that I just go, oh, I don't think I want to say that anymore. I mean, like one of the sayings that I grew up with was, you know, the pot calling the kettle black, which is really useful in lots of ways, and it kind of is a really clear in what it's said. But the sentiment behind it now is one I don't want to have anything to do with. And
Yeah.
but they're useful language shortcuts, and it's just like, well, how do I say that as concisely and as clearly in a different way? And finding that new language, and I think it's doable, and I think we're becoming better storytellers for that sharpening and for that consideration. And I don't think we don't always need to change the stories. It's the, as you're saying, it's the language and the viewpoint, and and those stories about kind of, you know, domestic abuse and rape and the power struggles. We need those stories, I think, now as much as we ever had. I mean, there's still conversations that we absolutely need to have, and those stories exist for a reason. Um, but how we tell them and how we use them and how we look at them, maybe, you know, that is what we can change and play with and experiment with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a responsibility, and I think it's an ever-changing one as well, because I mean, Elaine just said that's how language changes and develops and evolves, and you know, we work with language, we're word weavers, that's literally our job. And if we cannot adapt to how language is changing, then what is the purpose of us as storytellers? And that doesn't mean we're going to get it right all the time. I do think it's important to accept that there will be times when I will be in a space, whether I'm telling a story or running a workshop, and I will think afterwards, that word that landed differently, or I shouldn't have used that in that way because then it shaped the rest of what we were doing. But I think that's the joy of the work that I do, because I get to do it again the next day and do it slightly differently.
Mm. And there's always, we're never going to reach perfection, and I think that's, I know when I became a storyteller, kind of, again, we're talking about stereotypes and that thing of being a young and beautiful woman, and kind of like once you're past that, then your kind of your worth is diminished. And I think in so many jobs, it kind of felt, certainly when I was entering them as a young woman, that kind of women had quite a short shelf life in them. Whereas kind of coming into storytelling, it's like I'm really looking forward to being the old haggard storyteller, kind of with the years of experience and the earned wrinkles, and kind of, it's one of the few places that I feel like kind of that's a gravitas to be valued. And now I am getting older, I think I can own that anywhere. I'm quite happy to be wrinkled and old. and
And there's a joy in being at the beginning of this journey. I have no sense of being even a third of the way through my journey as a storyteller. I've been telling stories professionally for, oh God, 7 or 8 years now. And I know that I am still in the early apprentice stages of this. I and I've been told this as well by people. Just because it is something that you gain gravitas as you get older, as your repertoire builds, as your experience builds. I know I'm a better storyteller now than I ever thought I would be 7 years ago. I sometimes find myself in working situations now where I'm telling or running a workshop, and I think, God, it has paid off, actually. The work that I've done, the kind of, we've talked about this before as well, the sort of, I didn't really have any formal storytelling training. I have had performance training, I've had mentoring and gone to workshops, but a lot of my kind of storytelling apprenticeship has been me putting myself into situations and saying, yeah, I can do storytelling, and then just sort of doing the storytelling and seeing what happens and learning from that.
Well, I'm just going to say, kind of, I'm not sure that my training was formal, but a lot of what my training with Duncan, when I was studying with Duncan, was just throwing me into situations that were uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
So he was doing to me what you've done to yourself. It's just kind of like, there we go. And yeah. Well, we could carry on, I think, for a long time. And as usual, it feels like we've only just got started, but it is now after 9 o'clock. There is another conversation that started on the chat. I am really happy, Melanie and Elaine, to have this conversation with you another time, and it's a conversation that I've been having a lot about. Yes, the black on a kettle refers to burnt, and it's not about skin, but if you have time, I did a podcast with my cousin Graham, who is a graffiti artist and is of mixed race, and we absolutely had this question is one of the things that we talked about, of him kind of coming to a realization of being black when he was sort of 6 or 7, and kind of not having really known that he was black before then, and going and looking up the words black and white in the dictionary, and he sat and read to me out of the dictionary all the things that are connotations with black: dark, dirty, impure, darkness of spirit, black-hearted, black-souled, swarthy. And then white, you've got pure as milk, innocent, clean, pure. They are so intertwined, those words, that I think it's very difficult to explain to children. Oh, but in mythology in Welsh, they're not talking about, they hadn't particularly met lots of black people. So yes, that there's quite a lot of mythology in both, and in my mythology with Duncan, there's a lot of mining. There's a whole thing about dirt and dwarves and kind of people who live under the ground, and being, that being a poor class as well, working class and dirty. It's about class, and it's still not necessarily very nice, and but it's not about skin color. But when white people colonized the world, there was a huge amount of archetype and stereotype with the colours black and white, and they call people black and white to make the most of using all of that negativity and positivity of colour. They didn't call people brown and pink, and they didn't do that because of this weight that the words black and white have, which absolutely anchored the all of the connotations with those words that they wanted to have, and they wanted to associate all the negativity with black people and all the positivity with white people. And that's my personal opinion anyway, which is why you can't unpick any of that. It's been done. And so I personally think we have to really find different ways of exploring that language and reclaiming black in positive ways. But it's a long process, and one that I haven't got definite answers to, and that's a personal journey that I'm on at the moment. So I'm just looking, right, so I did promise that we would look on the Q&A, and so we do have one question for you. We are going to wrap up soon, but Elaine has asked, Tamar, can you say more about your use of the combination of Welsh and English in your telling? She often wonders if you're saying the same thing in both languages or what else is happening.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And basically, I try not to repeat. As someone who does watch a lot of people telling bilingually, I find it really frustrating to have the same story told to me twice, once in Welsh and once in English. So Michael Harvey, who's also a Welsh storyteller, he's got a whole technique with how he does bilingual storytelling, and I don't think it's that dissimilar to mine. It's all about sort of how you set something up in English, which is probably going to be the majority language in the room, and then how you use Welsh to kind of keep that story moving in such a way that everyone understands what's going on. So one example is that I will sometimes use Welsh as the language of conversation in a story. So two characters can have a conversation. One might speak Welsh and one might speak English. We all know what's going on because there's enough kind of direct response that we know what's happening. Welsh is really useful for things like spells, descriptions, kind of coming deeper into the story, giving us a bit more fleshing it out. Stories are very repetitive. We have a lot of stuff happening many times. So going back to Ceridwen, maybe because I told it today, the story of Ceridwen, we have lots of transformations happening in that story. We get very used to the fact that we've got a character who keeps turning into different animals, to the extent that we can get to a point in the story where we've heard about Ceridwen turning into a greyhound. We've heard about her turning into an otter. And then I can say, I know that the character that she's chasing has become a little bird, so then I can tell her transformation into an eagle, but I can do it entirely in Welsh. A dyma hi'n troi I fewn I anifail lot mwy gyda adenydd mawr a chrafangau enfawr a ffug enfawr, a dyma hi'n hedfan allan o'r dŵr ar ei olau. So instantly everybody knows, because of how I've set that story up, she's become a really big bird. And there's some joy then in the audience and people who don't speak Welsh being like, what did she become? Did she become an eagle? And I'm like, yeah, she became an eagle. Cool, let's keep going, you know? So I think there's a way of setting up language where it becomes really fun. We enjoy the moments we don't necessarily completely understand. I can tell by the faces in the audience how much people need, okay, that person's really lost. I'm going to give them a bit more English so they get what's going on. But I do not want to tell that story twice. I don't want to go, done my section in English, do it in Welsh, done my section in English, do it in Welsh, because it's boring for me and it's boring for the people in the audience who can speak both languages. So it's much more fun. It's much more kind of interweaving, playing with language. Sometimes I'll change language halfway through a sentence. It's sometimes a bit challenging for me because my brain goes into bilingual mode where I actually do struggle to speak in one language, and I will kind of forget the word for something in English. So I'll say the word in Welsh. I'll be like, ysgyfarnog, and they'll be like, hair, and I'll be like, great, okay, we can continue with the story. I know what's going on. So I think of it as a playful thing, basically.
Well, I think this is a perfect question to end with, actually, from Cecilia, who says, Tamar, I've heard your fabulous tellings a couple of times on Zoom. Where can we hear more? Because that's what we all want to do now. We all want to hear you tell more. So when are you telling next? When can we hear you?
So I mean, if you go on my website, I've got a list of upcoming gigs on there. it's not particularly up to date. I need to update with like everything that's coming up in
And your
2025.
website is?
It is www.tamarelinedwilliams.com. I think it's .com. Yeah, it's .com. And on there, I've got a list of upcoming gigs. My next big one, I think, is going to be in Surrey Storytelling. I don't think it's Storytelling Cafe. It's Surrey Storytellers. I'm doing a show with my sister called Not Maid, Not Widow, Nor Wife, which is about the women in Victorian murder ballads who get murdered. We have a storytelling and singing show about that. It's a joyful topic, but it is a good show. So that's my next big one. But I've got lots of different gigs all over the place, some online, some in person coming up this year. So yeah, keep an eye on my website.
Fantastic. And Not Maid Nor Mother Nor Wife, that's on Zoom, is it?
No, that's
Or
going
is
to
it
be.
in
So if
person?
anyone's close to Surrey, come to Surrey and come and listen to that.
Because we still need to have it in blast. Sadly, we're ill, so we do need to sort out about getting you back to Blast, or maybe sorting out something online.
Yeah.
So yeah, watch the space. And definitely look at Tamar's website, which I'll also put onto the notes on the Taking the Tradition On YouTube channel. And as ever, if there's bits that you want to go back and you want to listen to again, then it'll take me a little bit of time just to top and tail this and edit it, but you will be able to find that on my YouTube channel, which is Taking the Tradition On. And there are lots of really fabulous conversations on there with storytellers from around the world. So go and have an explore through. They're all free. They're up there and sort of slowly creating an archive of just some really important conversations. And it feels like tonight, even though there's so much more we can say, it feels like the things that we've said tonight really needed to be said. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and to listen to you tonight, Tamar. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming and taking the tradition on with me. And thank you to all of you here for listening and coming and joining in and asking questions. And I'm really pleased that sort of Melanie saying, oh, she's really good to feel that she can air this down. Absolutely. Like none of us have all the answers, and this feels like this is a time when we need to be able to speak openly and we're all just feeling our way. And I've been really, personally trying to make myself very vulnerable over the last year and figure things out. And whenever I have made myself vulnerable, other people have been really positive and really accepting of that and really helpful, and particularly sort of people of colour have just been welcoming the chance to have the conversation, to have people who are willing to change and willing to listen. And I think knowing that you're in a place where you don't have the answer is actually a really, really positive place. And like we were talking about when you were learning storytelling, Tamer, same as me, kind of putting yourself in uncomfortable places and seeing how you do and what happens. That is how you learn. And that's what, if storytelling is about one thing, I think it's about learning and about growing and just trying to
always growing.
yeah. How can you grow if you know all the answers? Right. Thank you so much to all of you for coming, and thank you for taking the tradition on. Good night.